Welcome back to another introduction to insect taxonomy. This will be part 7, and we're going to start getting into the very close insect adjacent. We're going to be talking about the Entognatha's. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe or follow if you're on Rumble. It helps out a lot. I like to see you guys interacting. I like to see you guys' questions. And it just really encourages me to keep doing these. So last time we talked about the pancrustacea or the tetraconata, and these were the crustaceans and the hexapods. So once again, you have, let me turn this on to blue so we can see what's going on. You have, these are crustaceans, this is a crustacean, these are crustaceans. It's a paraphyletic group, and it does not include the hexapods. So the crustaceans were defined by, having an exoskeleton, just like all the arthropods, and jointed appendages. They have biramous appendages, which means that some of their appendages are split into 2 points. So this is like the crab claws or the shrimp split legs on the shrimp. I don't know if I mentioned this, and I really should have. The crustaceans have 2 sets of antennae, which is interesting because the hexapods will either have 0 or 1. So all insects actually have 1 set of antennae, but some of the hexapods will have 0. The crustaceans have 3 body segments: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen, but sometimes the head and the thorax are fused together into a cephalothorax, so sometimes they only have 2 segments. The crustaceans have gills, whereas the insects and the hexapods have a tracheal system usually, although they may be secondarily have evolved gills. And generally speaking, the crustaceans have oxygen-carrying pigments in their blood, whereas the insects generally do not. So we talked about the crustaceans, so now we're going to move on to the hexapods. And the hexapods are really divided into 2 groups, which are the insecta, which is what everyone's here to talk about, and the Entognatha's, which is not a true group. It's, again, a paraphyletic group, which encompasses this portion of the hexapod tree. And these are the extremely primitive insectoid or insect-like creatures that have some key differences. They're all very, very small. But in general, when we talk about the insects, what we mean is that these are invertebrates with 3 body segments, head, thorax, and abdomen, when we're talking about the insects. And they have jointed legs, just like all of the other arthropods. They have 1 set of antennae, which these guys have antennae, and these guys have antennae. So these have 1 set, these have 1 set, but these have 0 antennae. And they also generally have 2 compound eyes, which, again, these have eyes, but these don't have eyes. And they also generally go through some sort of metamorphosis. Although when we're talking about the really primitive insects like these, the Zygontoma and the Archaeonatha, they are ametabolists. They don't go through a set of metamorphoses, but they all do have one. All of these have one thing in common, which is they're hexapods, which means they have 6 legs. So that is one common characteristic. Another thing worth considering is, why are these called Entognatha's? And sometimes this clade here are called the Ectognatha's. This is an old term. The Entognatha's, while having very insectoid-like bodies, have a big structural difference in their heads. The Entognatha's have internal mouths, hence the name Entognatha's. And what I mean by that is, on an insect normally, let me do it down here. On an insect normally, their mouth parts are modified appendages that sit outside of their, sit on the outside of their face. And their actual mouth part, like the actual hole of their mouth, is located deep within inside their head, but their mouth parts are on the outside and they push things in. On the Entognatha, their mouth parts exist within pockets inside their head. So they have these internal mouth parts which exist inside pockets, and on the insects, the mouth parts are on the external portions of their head. So they actually have a very different they have a very different head structure compared to the insects. And also, with a big difference between the Entognatha and the majority of insects. The majority of insects are here in the Pterygoda, and pter means wing. The Entognatha don't have wings, so none of these will have wings. Almost all of the insects have wings, or have a life stage in which they have wings. So there are major differences there. So today we're just going to talk about the Entognatha in general. Next time, I think I'm going to spend just one section talking about the collembola, because the collembola are a fairly important group of Entognatha. They're a fairly large group. There's something like 17 families, and you will see them a lot if you collect soil or play in the soil at all, if you're a gardener or anything. And then we'll get into the insects proper. So this will be class Insecta, and we will talk about each of these families. We'll talk about the Archegnaths and the Zygentoma, which are very primitive insects that never go through metamorphosis, and they don't have wings, but you probably have them running around your house. And then we'll spend the rest of our time talking about the Pterygoda for the rest of this video series. So with that, let us talk about probably the most primitive of the Entognatha, the Protura. So the Protura are, again, very, very small. All of the Entognatha are small, but the Protura are extremely small. And they are best defined by their almost complete lack of anything. They generally live in soil. All of the Entognatha are generally associated with soil or leaf litter, things like that. But the Proturans are really defined by their complete lack of anything to really talk about. So they don't have eyes, so no eyes. Their mouths are in this sac here. That's what the Entognatha is referring to. They have this protruding head that forms a sac, and their actual mandibles and things are in there. They have no eyes. They have no wings coming off the second and third thoracic segments. They have 6 legs, but they only generally walk with their hind 4, and they use the 4 legs to kind of feel and grab. They have no antennae coming off of their heads, which is kind of strange for a hexapod. They have no pigment, no color. They will generally either be white or clear when you see them in the soil, and they are generally not much to talk about. They have most of the Entognatha have some sort of abdominal structure. They have no cerci, they have no furcula, they have no what is it called, a retinaculum. They don't have any of this, but you will see them occasionally. There's only 2 families known, I believe, unless that's changed recently. But they generally just will be found around in damp moss, damp soil, damp leaf litter, crawling around. And you will probably need a microscope to see them. They are generally, less than a millimeter long, definitely less than 2 millimeters long. So you will need help seeing them. There's not a ton to talk about there. But if we go and look at the next 2 groups, so we have the Diplura and the collembola. The Diplura are probably, they're more closely related to insects, but they have more to look at. So these are the Diplura. Again, they don't have a ton of characteristics. They are the Diplura, the di in the name refers to these 2 these 2 little tails, and these are called cerci. Or one is called a cercis. And they pretty much always will have 2 unless one gets torn off. They've got the 6 legs. They do have antennae, these beaded antennae. There's about 800 species of these worldwide, and again, they're very, very small. They are generally the biggest one on Earth is about 2 inches, but they're generally less than a millimeter. And you will again occasionally see them crawling around in the soil. Most of these are just kind of debris feeders, although occasionally you'll see them feeding on something else. They, again, don't have any exposed mouthparts. because they're entognathes, and this is a big difference when you look at these versus the insects. So you don't see those big tiger beetle mandibles on any sort of entognathe. There's much more diversity within the Diplura than there is in the Protura. There's 8 to 10 families. I don't know a ton about the Diplura. I'm not going to lie about that. Because they're just not something that I have come across a lot in my work. They generally, unless you're actually looking for them, you're not going to find them on stuff. So unless you're going out and collecting soil or leaf litter and sifting through it, you're not really going to find them. And they aren't of any real economic concern, so it's not something that a lot of researchers spend time on, but you should know that these exist. And then finally, within the Entognatha, we have the collembola. And the collembola are more concerning. There are a few pestilent species of these, and there's quite a lot of them. So let's see. They tend to, again, be very small. Occasionally, you'll get them up to 6 millimeters. But they're like 1 to 6 millimeters long. They do have eyes, although you can't really see them here. They do have antennae. They do have 6 legs. So they're much more insect-like. What is interesting about the springtails is that they have this thing called a furcula. This tail is called a furcula. And it is where they get their name from. So this tail, generally when they're alive, this specimen is dead. This is an entomobryid, and it is quite dead. It is folded underneath them, and they have a hook underneath them called the retinaculum. And they can use this tail kind of like a spring, so it folds back and then pops. And that's where they get the springtail from. And they can move very, very quickly. They can bounce around with these little springs, hence the name. And they're very, very mobile. They're omnivorous, so there are occasions where these will cause damage to plant roots or to plants, and so they can be pestilent. The Spinthurids are one family, Spinthuridae, which are known to be quite pestilent. That is not this. This is an entomobryid. No one really cares about these, but they are extremely common. Fairly easy to identify because they tend to be pretty long. They tend to have this little bushy tuft of seta. They have a fairly short furcula, fairly long antennae. But we'll go over this. I want to spend an entire section just talking about the entomobryids and their families. There are 17-ish families of the collembola. Did I say the collembola and their families? I may have said a different word there. There are 17-ish families of collembola. And of those 17 families, there's about a dozen which are major groups. Some of the families only have a handful of species in them. But there are a number of families that have hundreds and hundreds of known species. So there are some families that you should be able to recognize fairly easily. Entomobryids, this image here is one of them, because they do show up frequently on leaf litter or on garden plants. They do get into little nooks and crannies in people's houses. They are one of the first insects that, or insectoid creatures, the first hexapods that start to show up in the winter. Sometimes you'll see them on the snow, bouncing around. They're very, very interesting little creatures. They also, one other major anatomical structure that they have that other entognathes don't have, and you can't really see it here, it's so hard to see, but in the middle here, if you were to part their legs, they have a structure called a colophore. Let me see if I'm spelling that right. Yeah, so it is called a colophore. And it's kind of a weird thing. It excretes a mucus that's like a stickum glue. But we also think it helps regulate their water, that they can use it to kind of sponge up water in their environment. It's kind of a mystery structure, but it's basically a big peg that sticks out of them. It's bigger in some families than others, and it basically just is there. It does something, obviously, because they all have it for the most part, but all of its functions are not super well understood. There's not a ton of researchers working on the collembola, although they are pretty universal. So there's still a lot of mysteries with this group. So Next time I'm going to talk about the collembola in depth, all of the families of the collembola, or at least the major families of the collembola, not all of them. But and then next time start talking about the proper insects. So the winged insects in the Pterygoda and the wingless insects in the Zygentoma and the Archaeognatha. Okay, until then, I'll see you next time.